From his 1933 debut to his involvement in the current MonsterVerse franchise, King Kong has been a cultural icon in the sights of monster movie fans for over 90 years. As a result, the famous oversized gorilla would be featured in several films over the decades, along with spawning TV shows, comics, video games, and even a novelization of its original story. Unfortunately for Kong, however, there were a lot more projects that were to involve the large ape that are either lost or were never made in the first place. In fact, there seems to be a lot more of these ideas that never came to fruition than there are movies that actually ended up being made. And a lot of them hold some interesting elements to Kong that we've never seen before and likely never will, given the different reasons for why these movies were never made. But luckily, they've been documented enough for us to be able to talk about, and that's what I want to do today. I do want to make note that a lot of this video's information and admittedly inspiration came from a book titled Kong Unmade: The Lost Films of Skull Island by John LeMay. This book is such a cool, in-depth, and well-researched look at all of the lost and or unmade King Kong movies from over the years. I honestly didn't know the extent of just how many of these examples there were until I read this book. Full disclosure though, if I'm correct, there is a second edition to this book with updated info that I had no idea existed before making this video. So for today, I'm just working with what I have, and if I get anything wrong, as always, let me know in the comments down below. Obviously, for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to include every little bit of detail on these movies, but if you want to know more about them, along with other tidbits and information regarding Kong's upbringing, other ape movies that were inspired or intended to rip off Kong, and everything else in between, I highly recommend buying this book and reading it yourself. For today, however, I just want to focus on the ones that weren't made. But before we get into the video, there's a couple of things I'd like to talk about real quick. First off, Happy New Year's! Late New Year's by the time this video comes out, but a new year nonetheless. 2023 was such a great and important year for the channel, and I'm so incredibly grateful for the growth and support it's gained in this last year. I genuinely love making these kinds of long-form videos, and I plan to keep doing that this year, especially since I've got a lot of exciting stuff planned for 2024. With all that said, this brings me to the next thing I'd like to announce. I'm now on Patreon. That's right, boys, they've got me too. No one is safe. I've officially sold out. All jokes aside, I've been considering Patreon for a while now because YouTube is, you know, YouTube. And generally, it's just better and more safe to have multiple sources of income when it comes to being a content creator. That being said, this is completely optional. It's not going to take away from the content at all. If anything, it should help make the content better because that means I can pour more money into these videos, especially in regards to the research, as there are tons of resources that I need in order to make these videos as in-depth as they are. My Patreon page is very simple. It's one tier, $3 a month. For $3, you get a pretty standard list of perks, including a name mention and thank you at the end of every video, and exclusive posts and updates on future projects. However, the thing I'm most excited about for this page are the commentary videos. If you guys subscribe to my Patreon, you get access to an exclusive commentary series that I'm working on with my good friend Gambit, where we watch dinosaur movies while talking shit, making fun of each other, and overall, just being dumb little goofballs. We've recorded a few of these already, and they have been very fun and hilarious. I promise you it's not just an hour and a half of us sitting in silent watching a movie. We're actively talking, and we're having a lot of fun through it. The goal is to get one or two of these commentary videos out each month. But if you go check out the Patreon right now, you'll see that we have two up already. One on the critically acclaimed Velocipaster, and another on, you know, Disney's Dinosaur, which is an okay movie, I guess. It's no Velocipaster. These were a lot of fun to make. We have more of them coming, and if you want to see them, check out the link in the description below that will take you straight to my Patreon page. Alright, I think that pretty much covers everything. With all of that out of the way, let's get into the video. Creation. Believe it or not, King Kong was partly conceived by a movie that, 1, had nothing to do with him, and 2, was never fully made in the first place. This movie is called Creation, and it was initially proposed to RKO in 1929 by film director Harry O. Hoyt, who's directed several films from the early to mid-1900s, one of which most of you are likely familiar with being 1925's The Lost World. This is where Creation would get a lot of its influence. Hoyt basically wanted to take the overall idea of the Lost World and make something new and modern out of it. The idea was to make the story pretty similar, with an expedition of people venturing to a Lost World type of location that housed plenty of prehistoric animals including dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and ancient mammals. Except, of course, instead of taking place on a plateau in the Amazon rainforest like the Lost World, creation would take place on an island with all of these primordial threats that would be created by none other than special effects animator Willis O'Brien. According to LeMay's book, Hoyt approached the movie production studio RKO Pictures and pitched them the idea for creation while using prints of his Lost World movie as a reference, along with telling them that he not only plans to have O'Brien on board for the project, but that he's also going to get his money's worth out of him because Hoyt would tell RKO that he thought O'Brien could make a total of 37 dinosaurs for their movie in the span of only 8 weeks, 17 of which were to be primary dinosaurs and the rest of the 20 were to be background. The project seemed very ambitious, but RKO was willing to take a chance on it, so they gave the go-ahead for the movie's development and even gave Hoyt and O'Brien a $1.2 million budget to work with. With that, a storyline was created by screenwriter Beulah Marie Dix and Hoyt himself. What resulted was a story that focused on a group of people on a yacht trip. This group includes the wealthy Armitage family who owned the yacht, which consisted of the father, Thornton Armitage, his adult daughter, Elaine Armitage, and his younger son, Billy Armitage. With them is Elaine's fiancé, Ned Hallett, their aunt Louise, their cook Benny, and finally, Steve, the hired tutor for Billy who's taken a liking to Elaine. And as a result, he's in this love triangle between himself, Elaine, and her fiancé, Ned. While out at sea on the yacht, an imminent storm cuts the trip short and threatens the lives of the crew, before a submarine sent by the Chilean Navy emerges from the waters and saves our characters. But the problems don't end there, as a literal island also surfaces from the water. The storm forces the submarine towards the island, causing it to crash against some rocks that open up the hole and flooding it with water. They eventually surface the damaged sub in a lagoon and begin exploring the island, where they encounter all sorts of immediate threats. This includes an arsenitherium in a scene that would later be reused in 1933's King Kong, where as the group attempts to cross a gorge on a large log, they encounter and are attacked by the large and hostile rhino-like animal, causing many of them to fall to their deaths or get impaled by its large horns. There's another encounter where Steve runs into and is almost killed by a woolly mammoth. There's another sequence where, after an undisclosed amount of time on the island, the group is at their campsite before they are attacked by a brontosaur after Ned angers it from trying to shoot it. Eventually, the brontosaur is driven away, and Ned, who I guess is the closest thing to this story's villain, is chastised by the group for doing something stupid and endangering everyone. Pissed off, Ned goes off with the gun and encounters a baby triceratops. And what do you do when you see a baby dinosaur while being angry at the fact that you had just been reprimanded for doing something stupid? That's right, you shoot it in the eye. So fun fact about this sequence, while the movie itself was never shot, some test footage was recorded to show RKO what the dinosaurs looked like in action, along with showing them what they looked like in the same frame as live animals and humans. Only about 5 minutes of this test footage exists today from this movie, and it features a baby triceratops wandering too far from its mother. At the same time, a pissed off Ned, played by Ralph Harold, runs into the baby and shoots it right in the eye, which we're able to view from the scope of his rifle. He walks up to the now dead baby triceratops, which seems to be a life-size mock-up of the stop-motion model. What follows is an understandably angry mother triceratops chasing Ned right before cutting off. However, in writing, the scene continues with Ned getting impaled by the mother. It's implied the scene of Ned getting impaled was also recorded but is now lost. Going back to the rest of the story, Steve and the rest of the group eventually make their way to some ancient ruins that hold treasure and more prehistoric animals. A pterodactyl almost kidnaps Elaine and is stopped by Steve while the rest of the crew is chased by a stegosaurus. They eventually run into a temple that houses a tyrannosaur mother and her young, and feeling threatened at the presence of another dinosaur, the tyrannosaur fights off the stegosaurus in a battle that, as cool as it sounds, would hold no candle to the one that we saw in Mark Polonia's movie Saurians. Now that is a masterpiece if I've ever seen one before. All while this is happening, the island also has an active volcano that's due to erupt about around this point in the outline. Just when our characters have given up hope and Steve and Elaine confess their love for each other, the group is spotted by a plane in the sky and are promptly saved from the island. The film would end on an epilogue that features a pterodactyl that managed to escape the island and ends up falling from exhaustion onto the rescue boat that our characters are now on. And that was supposed to be Creation. As fun and exciting as this movie sounds, it unfortunately was never made. At least not completely. The movie did get decently far into production, with O'Brien apparently completing several of the creature models, including an assortment of dinosaurs, a couple of pterosaurs, and the Arsinotherium. Some sets were also designed and built, and along with that, the test footage was also shot of Ned and the Triceratops, but that wasn't the only footage that was shot. In fact, there was about 20 minutes of total shot footage, some of which may have been reused for other RKO projects, though it's not completely certain, and others that are still completely lost. There was also footage of the shipwreck, the submarine, the island emerging from the ocean, and various shots of the animals which were hard to maintain on set. The test footage would end up being a rather large expense for RKO, costing around $131,000. From here, things began to slow down for production. Deadlines weren't being met, promises weren't being kept, and before you knew it, Hoyt was trying to scale back the movie's story in an attempt to keep the project from getting cancelled, even going as far as to cut out certain scenes that maybe took a little too much time, effort, and money to make, and instead replace them with more straightforward scenes. Like, for example, instead of a yacht approaching a deadly storm, it would be a plane crash on the island. Instead of many people getting killed off by many animals, it would just be Ned killed off by one of the dinosaurs. Despite this, the movie would ultimately be cancelled by filmmaker Marion C. Cooper, who saw a flaw in Creation. It didn't have a central antagonist. Cooper, who had his own movie idea in the plannings, saw the potential behind Creation and intended to use its elements for his own movie. For him to cancel the movie, some might say this was a fucked up move from Cooper, especially since he's described Creation as, and I quote, just a lot of animals walking around. But honestly, it seemed that Cooper was onto something with his whole central antagonist thing, because he would take several elements of Creation, including a lot of the material made for it, and use it in his own film, which was to be 1933's King Kong. 1933's King Kong original story. The origins of 1933's King Kong was actually a culmination of many things. Yes, many of the ideas and elements of Creation were reused for the film, but it's not what necessarily conceived the entire idea of King Kong. The conception came from Marion C. Cooper's fascination with wildlife, mainly with that of apes, which he had since he was younger. That interest seemed to follow him in his filmmaking career, as he would become inspired to make a documentary on gorillas after witnessing a family of baboons during the filming of another movie he directed called The Four Feathers. But the idea for the movie came in other places as well. Cooper also had a fascination with Komodo dragons after reading a book titled The Dragon Lizards of Komodo, written by William Douglas Burden in 1927. The book details the expedition that Burden and his wife took to the islands of the Dutch East Indies in the hopes of searching for the giant, almost dinosaur-like lizards themselves, which they would eventually encounter. They would then take these specimens back to New York City with them, where they would be put on display, some as live specimens, and others being killed and harvested. See the connections yet? With his interest in these two great animals, Cooper couldn't help but think what a scenario would look like if the two beasts were pitted against each other. And this was kind of the first iteration of King Kong, even though it technically wasn't King Kong quite yet. The idea was to document both animals in their natural habitats before eventually pitting them against each other, which wasn't supposed to be an actual recorded fight between the two animals. Instead, the footage would be spliced with other footage of people in animal suits fighting each other. But there were many aspects of both Burden's story and other areas of inspiration that would cause Cooper to want to incorporate things in his film that would turn it less of a documentary and more of a sci-fi adventure. Apparently, the idea of a woman being abducted by King Kong came from a real-life event in which a woman was taken by a gorilla that displayed some level of attraction to her, which was recorded in a book titled Explorations and Adventures in Equatorial Africa. In the first true iteration of King Kong, the basic story outline featured a group of people that traveled to a tropical island and run into a gorilla, which was initially going to be a real gorilla. There would be a sequence of the ape fighting off prehistoric lizards that would be played by actual Komodo dragons before eventually kidnapping the female of the group. Soon, the gorilla is captured by the rest of the men and is taken to New York City, where he somehow gets loose and is killed. And I think at this point, the ape is supposed to be regular sized, but I don't know for sure. But as time went on, the idea went through many different changes, mainly in the form of how the animal scenes were going to be created. When Cooper was eventually hired by RKO to help produce The Most Dangerous Game, likely to get his foot in the door with the company, which would likely get him a step closer to making his movie, which by the way, wasn't going by King Kong yet, at least not that I know. After his work on The Most Dangerous Game, Cooper eventually ran into a production at RKO that really sparked his attention. This was the movie Creation, and when he saw that things weren't looking too great for it, he would make the move to suggest his gorilla movie instead, and as a result, Creation would be cancelled. After Creation was cancelled, Cooper now had an arsenal of dinosaur props and materials at his side that, if I were to guess, RKO likely suggested for him to use so that they didn't go to waste. Money, time, and effort were put into these models, and it would have been an absolute waste to not use them. So Cooper decided to use the dinosaur models instead of live Komodo dragons. And considering a lot of these models were large-sized dinosaurs, some of which Cooper's gorilla was to fight during the movie, I think this was around the time they decided to increase Kong's overall size. Along with that, an official title was also given to the movie. It went under a couple of different names, some of which possibly being throwaways until a more suitable name came along, but they included Giant Terror Gorilla and The Beast, before eventually being given the title of King Kong. A script for the movie was written, and it would be about a big game hunter by the name of Danby Denham, who's looking to hunt something different but grand to put on display in America. When he hears the story of a mysterious sea serpent off the coast of Vapor Island, he has the ship's captain, Captain Englehorn, set sail in that direction. Meanwhile, the script also focuses on a group of prisoners and a single woman on a lifeboat out in the middle of the ocean. The prison transport ship that they were initially on had sunk for unknown reasons, and I assume the woman with them, whose name is Shirley, was a worker on that ship. The group eventually makes it to Vapor Island, where they are immediately attacked by a brontosaurus, which is described to be the sea serpent that was mentioned earlier. Things aren't much better when they get to land, as the group are attacked by various different animals, including a pterosaur, a triceratops, and a theropod of some kind. Other encounters include giant snakes. There's a piece of concept art that shows one of the crew members running into a giant carnivorous plant, and eventually they'd also meet Kong himself. Shirley first meets him after one of the convicts attempts to have his way with her before she is saved by the large gorilla, who I assume killed the convict. This is where Kong kidnaps Shirley, and when the rest of the group attempt to save her, it ends poorly for many of them, because they follow him over a log bridge that Kong manages to knock down into the pit below with all of the men on it. In the pit, they run into even more terrifying creatures, some of them being octopus tentacles and giant crabs. Shortly after, there's a dinosaur battle sequence with Kong and some theropod dinosaur that's not named, and after the battle is won, Kong takes Shirley up to his rock lair in the mountains, where a couple of the survivors from the pit follow to continue their attempt to rescue her. One of these men, named John, had fallen in love with Shirley, and even after some scenes of Shirley and Kong bonding, she goes off with John, which angers Kong, and soon the two are being pursued by him. They eventually make their way to the beach, where they finally run into Denham, who uses a trichloride bomb to knock the giant ape out and take him back to New York City to make millions off of him. During a show in Madison Square Garden, Shirley is pushed into a tiger cage by a jealous performer, and her screams alert Kong, causing him to break out, save Shirley, and carry her in his mouth as he makes his way up the Empire State Building during a storm. Police follow after him in the building with machine guns and shoot at him before Kong is struck by lightning, causing him to fall to his death. He holds Shirley one last time before he eventually dies. Of course, this idea didn't stick, and a lot of changes were made, but this was the first version of the script that had been written out, and many of the ideas were still used, including the log scene, Kong fighting a theropod dinosaur and taking Shirley up to his rock lair, and his eventual capture and sequence in New York City. But ultimately, there were a lot of changes made in between that would make King Kong the classic that we know today. Speaking of which, considering we're on the topic of 1933's King Kong, and this is a video talking a lot on lost King Kong content, I'd be remiss to not at least mention the notorious spider pit scene. In the final cut of 1933's King Kong, there was a scene in the movie that was allegedly cut out and hasn't seen the light of day since its initial screening in theaters. Or was it? Before we get into that, I'll explain the scene. More specifically, this is the log scene, and the scene depicts the sailors being shaken off the log by Kong himself. And they end up falling into a pit containing all sorts of nightmarish creatures. Giant spiders, insects, worms, and two-legged lizards begin to attack the survivors of the fall. A scene that reportedly made people in theaters so scared, some actually fainted from watching it. At least that's how the story goes. Many people seem to throw around the idea that the reason why the scene was cut was because of how terrifying it was for audiences at the time. To see all of this death from such gruesome, ugly creatures in this updated style of stop motion made it seem too real and just too much for them. However, according to LeMay's book, Cooper himself apparently said at one point, the reason why the scene was cut was because it stopped the movie's story. While some seem to interpret this differently, it's likely Cooper was talking about the movie's pacing, and that the scene may have slowed it down too much for his liking, so it was cut. Or at least, that's what people say. In a more recent account of this story, namely from Ray Morton from a 2021 interview with the Kaiju Transmissions podcast, he states the scene was never filmed and that there was no spider pit sequence at all. For those of you that don't know, Morton is an author that actually wrote his own history book on King Kong back in 2005. In the interview, he explains his stance further.
Can I debunk the other one?
Yeah.
The one that drives me
Yeah,
crazy?
what's that?
The spider pit sequence. Never filmed. That's it. End of. It was never filmed. There is no lost spider pit sequence, and that's that.
So, okay. Well, see, that's a little bit of a that is a little bit of a curveball because there's that note from Cooper that said that he screened it for like an executive or something, and that it stopped the movie.
Yes.
So
Cooper made up a lot of stuff.
Okay. Okay. Well. Okay.
Of course, that wasn't the only argument he made. He goes on to state that there were multiple scenes aside from the spider pit sequence that were never filmed. This includes a tar pit scene that features a Triceratops mother and her young, likely the ones from Creation, where it would feature King Kong running into this family of Triceratops stuck in a tar pit. There was another scene of Kong in New York City jumping from rooftop to rooftop that was also cut. Then of course, we have the spider pit sequence. According to Morton, the reason why these scenes are lost are because they were never filmed in the first place.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you the room to kind of unpack what the deal is with the spider pit sequence.
Well, here's the thing. You always hear about the lost spider pit sequence. How come you never hear about the lost rooftop jump sequence or the lost Triceratops in the tar pit sequence? And the reason you don't hear about them is like the spider sequence, they were never filmed. The original script of Kong, and it's in the screenplays. You can, if you look up the original writing, there's a sequence when Kong is going through the jungle where he encounters a mother Triceratops and her two babies, and one or more of them is stuck in the tar pit, and he goes to get them or something, and they end up having a fight. Okay, I know there's a big fight around the tar pit, and then there is the spider pit sequence, and then there is the original escape from the theater in New York. In the current film, he knocks down the 3rd Avenue L, the subway. In the original cut of the film, that was a last-minute filmed sequence. Kong was supposed to go up on the roof of the hotel, and where Jack and Carl Denham come out, and they're like, "We gotta, get the spotlights. We gotta chase him." There was a whole sequence where Kong jumped from building to building, tracked by floodlights, by police floodlights, and that's how he made his way to the Empire State Building. So those were 3 sequences that were in the original script. There are some production illustrations because they were planning to do the scenes, and most of the sets were built for it, and there were test sequences. But the thing about King Kong is what people don't, one of the weird things people say about, oh, is this B movie? It's like, Kong was not a B movie. Kong was a really expensive film. It cost at the time double like what an A picture was in those days, a big budget studio spectacular. It cost twice what the average spectacular was, and it had budgetary issues, and basically they were told, you have to cut back on some of the sequences because this movie is just costing way too much. And Cooper made a decision. He cut the tar pit sequence, he cut the spider pit sequence, and he cut the jumping from rooftop sequence. The quote you always hear from Cooper is, he said, well, it stopped the story dead. And he's right. It did stop the story dead, because it would have been a 5-minute sequence that involved not Kong. It would have involved all these other characters, but it wouldn't have involved Kong. And from a pacing point of view, I understand why they cut it. Okay, like, because it would have slowed the movie down. But the reason that I know it was never filmed is really simple. If you look at the production reports, it was never on the schedule. All the scenes in the movie that are in the film are on the production schedule. And I'm talking both about the animation production schedule and the live action shooting, because there was a live action portion and there was a miniature unit. They never filmed it. It's not in any of the production reports. And if you look at the production screenplay, those 3 sequences are all X'd out in the production screenplay because they knew they weren't going to film them.
So where did those photos come from?
The photos were tests. They had built the sets, and they built the sets for all 3 sequences. And even the jumping from rooftop to rooftop sequence, the buildings were rephotographed. Those are the background buildings when Jack and Denham come up on the roof. So they repurposed some of that. So the sets were all built, and they shot tests for everything. Like they were going along making the movie. They were intended to shoot it, but it got to a point where it's like, we can't afford to do these sequences. Basically cut the ones you don't think are necessary.
There's definitely more that he had to say about this scene, but for the sake of brevity, I'll leave it here. If you want to know more about it, I highly recommend listening to the entire episode of the podcast. It's actually a really great listen. According to LeMay's book, if the Lost Spider Pit sequence was ever part of filming, it was only shown once, at a test screening in San Bernardino, California. Of course, given Morton's account is true, that's a huge if, and he even states that maybe brief test footage was shot, but considering it was just test footage, it likely would have been burned or disposed of before being put in the actual film. Over the years, there have been many guesses and rumors as to what may have happened to the spider pit scene. Given, of course, it actually exists, some think it had been destroyed and will never be shown again. Others think that certain parts of the props from it were reused in other O'Brien works, like the spider from 1957's The Black Scorpion, though there doesn't seem to be any evidence that backs this up. But what do you guys think? King Kong made in Japan. In October of 1933, Japan released a silent short film called King Kong Made in Japan, which was meant to be played before the actual King Kong movie in Japanese theaters. The film was officially approved by RKO, and development was made under the Japanese media company Sochiku, who also dubbed the original King Kong movie for Japanese audiences. The movie features a pair of homeless men, Santa and Koichi, wanting to strike it rich so that he has his girlfriend's father's approval to be with her. Santa attempts to create his own King Kong show after he sees the American version becoming so successful in Japan. He dons a gorilla suit and makes a deal with a vaudeville theater to create a King Kong showing, which ends up being an instant success. But not before Omitsu, Santa's girlfriend, or at this point ex-girlfriend, had moved on to her new boyfriend, which was likely set up by her father. During one of his performances, Santa notices Omitsu and her new boyfriend in the audience, and he becomes so angry at the sight of this, he jumps off the stage and chases her boyfriend out of the theater and into the streets, all while he still has the gorilla suit on. This leads to what I assume is meant to be a series of comedic antics, where people think he's an actual animal on the loose and the authorities are soon after him. But Santa is able to catch up to Omitsu's boyfriend, knocks him out, and puts the ape suit on him before the authorities show up. When he heads back to the theater, Santa is told that the showrunners have offered him more money to keep performing as King Kong. And so, with his new job and fame, he's finally able to marry Omitsu. Seems like a funny little short, but unfortunately, it's now considered lost. What might have happened to it, it's not really known. Maybe a vault fire, maybe the film material decayed, or maybe it was one of the many victims to the Hiroshima bombing in World War II. The New Adventures of King Kong. After the success of King Kong, a sequel was unsurprisingly made for it, which was called Son of Kong. After that movie, another film was planned to continue the King Kong saga, but it wasn't going to be a traditional sequel. Instead, this movie was meant to be set during the events of King Kong's voyage from Skull Island to New York City. The idea was that the ship that Kong was being carried on, called the Venture, was forced to stop at the Malay archipelago after sustaining some damage on their way to New York City. When the crew are attacked by some unnamed creatures on the island, they're forced to set Kong free to fight them off. Once he does, Kong runs into the jungle with the men in pursuit to recapture him, leading to a whole new adventure. The film was never realized due to a lack of interest from RKO. Apparently, Son of Kong had mixed reception and simply did not have the same fanfare as the original King Kong movie, so there wasn't a whole lot of confidence for a third movie. The Lost Island. The Lost Island was going to be a short King Kong musical parody from 1934 made by Christie Studio and was to feature marionette puppets on strings and people in monster suits. Considering King Kong's instant success, it's really no surprise that there were people who wanted to make their own versions of it, in this case in the form of a spoof. While not much is known about the short itself, there are a few still images left behind from its production featuring the puppets and King Kong himself, who was going to be played by Charles Gomorrah, who's had a pretty fruitful career starring in movies in a gorilla suit. There's one still of one of the characters encountering the dinosaur or dragon in a cave. There's another of Anne tied to a stone pedestal with Kong behind her. Another of Kong fighting the dinosaur or dragon in the background with the characters in the foreground, probably singing their musical numbers. And finally, one of Kong sitting on the dinosaur. The project was only going to be one reel, which if I'm correct, would have only been about 11 minutes. Despite the short time frame, the project was never realized due to budget constraints. According to some accounts, however, the project was going to be shot in Technicolor, which hadn't been done before for short films. So had it been made, it would have set the record for being the first short film to use Technicolor. Tarzan vs. King Kong. So back when he was first developing his story for King Kong, before it was even called King Kong and it was just known as his ape movie, Cooper had also attempted to get the rights to Tarzan as well. At the time, I think Cooper's plan was to make two separate movies in which he could use African wildlife footage for both. His initial plans to obtain the rights to Tarzan would fall through, but the idea to try again would return a couple of years later after he was hired as the vice president of a smaller and newly formed film company called Pioneer Pictures. When trying to figure out new movie ideas, Tarzan vs. King Kong was suggested to Cooper, who attempted to contact MGM about getting the rights to Tarzan, but was yet again denied. On top of that, there was also the problem of who owned the rights of King Kong, which is going to be a recurring issue as we continue this list. At the time, Cooper thought he had the rights to King Kong, but RKO was claiming that they owned the rights to him. So even if Cooper wanted to make a sequel to King Kong, it was going to be tough because RKO wasn't going to just let him make a movie without giving him a problem. Unfortunately, as far as a movie goes, this seems to have been the extent of Tarzan vs. King Kong, though a comic was made of it much later in 2016. King Kong appears in Edo. So whether this movie can really be seen as a King Kong film or not is debatable. That being said, it's clear Kong had some influence to it, at least enough to put his name in the movie's title. RKO's King Kong was such a huge hit that it would be re-released to theaters several times, most of which would also be huge successes. Some say King Kong Appears in Edo was made by a small Japanese movie company as a way to capitalize off of King Kong's 1938 re-release. But it's hard to say considering this is also a lost movie. Only a few stills and the movie's cover exists today, and there's not a whole lot of information about it out there. But luckily, we have the film's synopsis. The story is about a wealthy and corrupt man named Huey Toba, whose daughter is kidnapped, causing him to announce a cash reward for her safe return. Turns out, one of Toba's workers, Maganoyo, planned out the kidnapping as a form of revenge towards his boss for making him do nefarious things against his will. Instead of King Kong actually appearing in some form in this movie, Maganoyo's father has a trained pet ape simply named King Kong, which Maganoyo forced to kidnap Toba's daughter. While it's not entirely clear how the events pan out, we do know that Maganoyo was able to make off with the reward money for finding Toba's daughter. Toba would be killed by King Kong, and Kong himself would be wounded by Toba's men, leading to his eventual death. Abbott and Costello meet King Kong. Bud Abbott and Lou Costello were a comedy duo from around the mid-1900s, and together the two worked on all sorts of media projects from radio to movies. At one point, the duo were going to have themselves an adventure on Skull Island that never came to fruition, but some of the idea was apparently used for an early draft of a movie that did get released that also featured the comedic duo, which was called Abbott and Costello Meet Captain Kidd. While the finished product does feature an island called Skull Island, it's a simple one with no monsters on it. However, according to LeMay's book, an early draft revealed that Skull Island used to look a lot different in this movie. In that early draft, Abbott and Costello joined Captain Kidd's voyage to Skull Island in search of treasure. Upon arrival, the crew is greeted by natives that take one of the female sailors and uses her as a sacrifice to King Kong, who takes her and heads back into the jungle. The rest of the crew follow after him, running into dragons and giant reptiles and insects before eventually catching up to Kong, where it's revealed that Skull Island actually houses a whole family of Kongs. They eventually save the female sailor after they wait for the apes to fall asleep, but before long, Kong is after them, forcing them to escape from the island through a secret passageway that houses a giant spider. Despite this obstacle, they're able to make it back to the beach, with a little bit of the treasure that they were able to find during their adventure, and they escape, but not before Captain Kidd tries to betray them. Luckily, he's left behind on the island, and the crew continue on their way, finishing the movie off of Skull Island. Initially, the movie was going to be two separate projects, one about just Captain Kidd and the other being the Abbott and Costello Meet King Kong movie from earlier. Somewhere down the line, the two projects were molded into one before eventually they ditched the King Kong element entirely. It's not exactly known why it wasn't made, but LeMay guesses a rights issue likely killed the project. The Eighth Wonder. The Eighth Wonder is an attempt from Cooper to remake King Kong in the 50s, though no one seems to truly know whether this film was really going to be a remake, as some sources suggested that it was going to take place during King Kong's voyage from Skull Island to New York City, essentially being another attempt at the Adventures of King Kong movie that was originally meant to be a third movie to the original 1933 version. There was likely still a lot of legal issues with who owned King Kong's name that prevented Cooper from continuing the project, but he seemed pretty adamant on a new Kong movie, and the factor that killed the project was the death of a colleague that was working on a new camera method for a movie company that Cooper was working for at the time called Cinerama. According to this excerpt in LeMay's book, at the time, the process for Cinerama utilized 3 cameras placed side by side, which shot in perfect synchronization so that the film could be then projected by 3 projectors on 3 screens in a 180-degree configuration. Unfortunately, the process was never finished, and thus the movie never went forward. King Kong vs. Frankenstein. In one of the most infamous cases of an unrealized King Kong reboot, King Kong vs. Frankenstein was conceived by Willis O'Brien, who was not only heavily associated with King Kong, but was also a fan of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein book, which in turn made him want to make his own adaptation of it. In a way, this project could have given him that chance. So in 1958, O'Brien began to plan out his King Kong Frankenstein film. The movie would have also served as a sort of sequel to the original King Kong, as it was set to take place after the events of that movie, where it's revealed that King Kong had not died after falling from the Empire State Building, but rather he was in a comatose state because of it. This movie would have also featured Carl Denham, who would have taken this opportunity to take Kong back to his rightful home, Skull Island. Then the movie would transition to the actual time it's taking place in 30 years later. Denham ends up going back to Skull Island after all of these years and captures Kong again for some reason. It's never stated why, but this was early on in the story's development phase, so this was likely a detail that would have been more fleshed out had it been fully made. Meanwhile, Frankenstein's grandson is raising the dead after his new science experiment becomes an absolute success, because he's able to create a giant monstrosity out of dead animal material. From here, you can probably tell what happens. Both Kong and Frankenstein's monster eventually escape from the shackles of their captors and take their fight to the streets of San Francisco. That was at least the first draft of the movie. In the second draft, it went by a different title, King Kong vs. the Ginkgo, due to the fact that there was some concern regarding the legality of using Frankenstein in their movie, since it was thought at the time Universal owned the rights to the character. In this one, it's explained that Denham wants Kong to be pitted against what would have been the Frankenstein monster in a staged fight as a way to profit off the two creatures. Ginkgo's story in this draft is that it originated in a lab in Africa, but killed its creator and managed to escape only to be captured and brought to fight Kong. Kong, as you'd likely already guess, was captured from Skull Island. In a sequence that I can only assume was maybe leading up to the stage fight, it features the monster holding onto a tightrope above its head with a girl walking over it before it eventually breaks. Ginkgo catches the girl, and Kong, who I'm assuming sees this as faint memories from his time during the first film, instinctively goes on the attack by breaking out of his cage and going after the monster. The fight is taken into the streets of San Francisco and eventually up the Golden Gate Bridge, before the two fall into the water, ending the battle and the movie. When O'Brien pitched the idea to RKO's president, he was directed to movie producer John Beck, who would take O'Brien's script and hire a scriptwriter to make some changes. In this new draft, it went by a new title called King Kong vs. Prometheus, and it would have featured a doctor named Kurt, descendant of Victor Frankenstein, who would create and is able to remote control the monster before it's revealed that he was never able to, who only pretended to be controlled by Kurt, who by the way is revealed to not be a descendant of Frankenstein, and the monster gets the jump on him. After the monster kills Kurt, his battle with Kong begins. After finding out that O'Brien actually didn't have the rights to King Kong and instead it was RKO that did, Beck would then take the script to multiple studios within the States, all of which declined turning it into a movie. Beck would then take the script to international territories and eventually found himself in Japan knocking on Toho's doors asking if they were interested in it. He did this without telling O'Brien, and Toho decided to go for the project, forked over $220,000 for the rights of Kong, which allowed them to use him for the next 5 years, and threw out O'Brien's script to make their own. Because with Kong at their disposal, a famous American movie monster, they could easily pit it against their own famous movie monster and make more profit doing that. So they replaced Frankenstein with Godzilla, and King Kong vs. Godzilla was born. It wasn't until O'Brien read about the news from the papers where he would finally find out about this deal made behind his back. And on top of this, he wasn't going to be able to work on the film like he hoped to. And since Japan was used to suitmation over stop motion, that's how they were going to bring Kong to life, much to O'Brien's dismay. When Cooper found out about this, he wanted to sue RKO for making that deal because he thought he owned Kong. But at this point, things were still pretty murky with that. In the end, King Kong vs. Godzilla was made in 1962. The same year, O'Brien would unfortunately pass away. And to top it all off, King Kong vs. Godzilla would end up being one of Toho's most well-performing Godzilla films. Damn, O'Brien always got the short end of the stick when it came to these projects. It sucks that his King Kong vs. Frankenstein film never came to fruition. Baboon, A Tale About a Yeti. Okay, so in case you couldn't tell by now, some of these examples aren't going to be 100% King Kong movies. In fact, while some could argue King Kong played a role in terms of inspiration for this one, Baboon: A Tale About a Yeti is one of the examples that takes a pretty large departure from King Kong movies as a whole, as it's not even focused on a giant gorilla, but rather the discovery of the abominable snowman. The story was created by O'Brien, and like a lot of his previous ideas, it was never realized. Initially, O'Brien wanted the idea to be a part of a project of his that went by the name Triple Assignment. It was a film that told 3 different stories within it, with each one focusing on a different reporter working on a fantastical or supernatural assignment for the same magazine, which would have been called Independent Observe, that would connect all 3 stories. Each of the 3 stories would take place in different parts of the world. One would be in India and focus on a shrinking elephant, and another would take place in Baja California to focus on living flesh-eating plasma. The other story was to take place in the Himalayas and focus on a reporter who would cover a story about a scientist who was able to tame a Yeti. When O'Brien's idea fell through, he would take that Yeti story and flesh it out into a full story for a possible film. The story would have focused on a female scientist named Marion Town, who's looking for her father in the Himalayas after he attempts to find the abominable snowman. With her is her father's business partner, Kent Carr, and some Sherpas that guide them to their destination. Along the way, they also run into a pair of showmen named Taylor Smith and Fleming Ward, who contribute to the expedition and tag along with the group before they run into a lost city. From here, it's kind of your run-of-the-mill monster story. There's treasure in the lost city, at some point the group is attacked by a giant snake, and the Yeti is revealed and fights off the giant reptile, and eventually Marion finds her father, who actually befriended the Yeti. Smith and Ward want to take the Yeti back to civilization to profit off of it, much to Town's dismay. Despite this, the pair were able to trank the Yeti and force our protagonists to go along with their plans. They transport the Yeti back to civilization by ship, but on their way, a storm breaks out, causing the Yeti to escape and wreak havoc on the top deck. Town takes a motorboat to lead his Yeti friend off the ship and back to the Himalayas, but as he does this, he's attacked by a pod of orcas. In the Outline's climax, the Yeti is able to save Town and fight off the killer whales. Smith attempts to retrieve the Yeti but is pulled into the sea and is also killed by the orcas, killing our main antagonist. The Outline ends with the Yeti succumbing to the injuries dealt by the killer whales and sinks into the bloody ocean as our main characters helplessly watch on the ship that sails back to civilization. Continuation: King Kong vs. Godzilla. With how successful King Kong vs. Godzilla ended up being for Toho, a sequel was naturally planned. However, as you can already tell, it never happened. This was continuation King Kong vs. Godzilla. And while we never got a movie, a story outline was written by screenwriter Shinichi Sekizawa. The movie would revolve around Nomura, who leads a Japanese search party through an African jungle, searching for the crash site of a Japanese plane. The only survivor is said to be a baby, who is the niece or nephew of his ex-girlfriend, Mitsuko. That's because the baby had been taken care of by King Kong himself, who I guess made a home here in the African jungles after his initial fight with Godzilla. Speaking of Godzilla, his body was discovered near the waters where his and Kong's fight ended in the previous movie. His body is recovered and is to be displayed at an island resort. Going back to Kong, he gets attacked by a giant scorpion, giving Nomura the perfect opportunity to save the baby and head back to Japan. But he's not going to be able to escape Kong that easily, since the giant gorilla can easily find their location due to the telepathic bond that he formed with the baby. How? I'm not entirely sure, but this approaching presence concerns the people of Japan. And the only way they could think to counter Kong is resurrecting Godzilla to fight him off. They manage to wake Godzilla up from his comatose state, and their first fight takes place. Although it's short-lived, meaning along with Kong, the citizens of Japan now have 2 monsters to deal with. With Kong still going after the baby, the military attempt to contain Godzilla. Nomura and Mitsuko take the infant and try to get as far away from Kong as possible, which eventually takes them to Kagoshima, where Mount Aso starts to erupt. In the final climax of the film, Godzilla would show up emerging from the volcano and finally truly battle King Kong. The erupting volcano would put our protagonists in danger, namely the baby, who Kong would save one last time before the movie would end on an ambiguous note. Godzilla and Kong are taken over by the eruption, but were given no clear indication on a winner of the battle or if they survived at all. As far as why the sequel was never made, some sources that I've seen say it was because Toho was instead considering the idea of making a Godzilla vs. Frankenstein movie, which makes sense considering they were likely inspired by O'Brien's King Kong vs. Frankenstein story that they bought off of RKO. Since they already used Kong, why not use Frankenstein too? After all, he's also a very famous movie monster, but Godzilla vs. Frankenstein also never came to fruition, and instead they focused on making Mothra vs. Godzilla. But eventually they used the Frankenstein character in Frankenstein vs. Baragon. Operation Robinson Crusoe, King Kong vs. Ebirah. The planning for King Kong vs. Ebirah is a bit of a confusing one to me, but I'll try to explain it as best as I can, and if I get anything wrong, let me know in the comments down below. But from my understanding, the animation production company Rankin Bass Productions approached RKO for the rights of King Kong so that they could make an animated show about him. But along with an animated show, they also wanted a tie-in live-action film. The animated show was eventually produced, but for the film, Rankin Bass approached Toho, who at this point also had the rights to King Kong for their live-action movies, and asked if Toho could make them a live-action King Kong movie. Toho seemed more than willing to do this considering the success of King Kong vs. Godzilla, and were even looking to make a whole series of movies about King Kong. But this ended up falling through due to rights complications with RKO, at least that's what it sounds like. Regardless, Toho was still allowed to at least make that one-off film with King Kong, which they already started and finished a lot of props and materials for. However, RKO and/or Rankin Bass weren't happy with the story that Toho came up with, which would have involved King Kong fighting a giant condor, Mothra, and Ebirah, who, by the way, is a giant lobster kaiju. RKO and Rankin Bass backed out of the collaboration with Toho, who simply decided to switch King Kong's place with Godzilla, thus creating 1966's Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster. Hammer Films' King Kong. Back in the mid-60s, the British film production studio Hammer Films wanted to remake King Kong and approached RKO for the rights. They were denied because at the time, RKO was strictly focusing on handing out the rights to studios that were looking to make sequels or even loose continuations of King Kong. They didn't give up though, because a few years later in 1970, Hammer Films attempted to get a stop-motion remake of King Kong going again, this time inviting one of their special effects workers, David Allen, who had previously worked with the studio on When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth. Allen would even go as far as to make his own test footage of a colorized version of King Kong on top of the Empire State Building fighting off airplanes. However, RKO, once again, refused to give them the rights for a remake. But making the footage wasn't a complete waste for Allen, because a couple of years later, he was able to give it to Volkswagen, who used it in one of their commercials. Fun fact, in that commercial, Ann Darrow is played by Victoria Riskin, at least according to IMDb, who is the daughter of Fay Wray, who played Ann Darrow in the original 1933 King Kong. Space Kong. So this is an interesting example made up by Cooper, and from my understanding, one that wasn't even meant to be planned as a movie at first, or really at all. So just a little bit of background to explain this one. Back in 1932, a King Kong novelization to the 1933 movie would be written by Delos W. Lovelace. The rights to the movie are separate from the rights to the novelization because the novel was made before the movie, and thus, based on some weird copyright law at the time, it was considered to be the source material and had its own copyright. The rights to the novel were actually never renewed, so eventually the book went into public domain. But let's focus on the 1960s, when Gold Key Comics wanted to do a King Kong adaptation to the novel and were communicating with Cooper about the story. The comic would have featured characters that were descended from the ones from the original story, with the lead character being Carl Denham's daughter, and it would have involved them finding Kong back on Skull Island and discovering the Fountain of Youth. But there were a couple of issues that Cooper had with this idea. Cooper didn't like that King Kong was found back on Skull Island because it contradicts the events of the original story, and he didn't like the fact that the story had a female lead. He would express his concerns through a letter that he would send to his legal advisor, Charles Fitzsimmons. And through this, Cooper introduces a new and intriguing King Kong idea. The idea would consist of the lead characters going out to space to discover a small asteroid-sized planet, one half of which is where Kong, and presumably other prehistoric species of animals, inhabit, while the other half contains the fountain, or as Cooper describes, River of Youth. Fitzsimmons responded to Cooper telling him that he relayed his concerns to the comic writers, but also told him that his idea for what is essentially a King Kong in space story was interesting enough to be a movie, and even suggests to Cooper to save it in case the opportunity ever came up. Of course, as you can see, it never did. ABC's King Kong. So, in case you couldn't tell already, when it comes to the history of King Kong and the many attempts to remake it, it's very complicated. In this particular case, this version of King Kong would end up starting a legal battle between two huge movie studios. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before I get into this story, I do want to point out that some elements of it are alleged and may not be 100% correct, because there are many names involved that maybe saw the story differently. But according to an article published by the New York Magazine, the vice president of ABC, Michael Eisner, thought about remaking King Kong after watching a rerun of the original on TV. He would bring the idea up to the president of MCA Universal, Sid Sheinberg. Sheinberg seemed to be somewhat interested in it and mentioned this idea to his friend, the president of Paramount, Barry Diller. What the original idea of King Kong would have looked like for ABC, we'll never know, because the moment the idea was told to associates of these two huge movie studios, it was out of Eisner's hands. Diller of Paramount would get himself a potential director, Dino De Laurentiis, and Sheinberg of MCA Universal would get a potential producer from his respective studio. Of course, these two men didn't know what the other was doing, and before they knew it, there would be a fight for the rights of King Kong. The Legend of King Kong. The Legend of King Kong was Universal's attempt at a King Kong remake back in the 70s, and it was a very long and complicated road that I'm going to do my best to summarize. This initially started with Jim Danforth wanting to revisit the idea of making a King Kong movie. Of course, he couldn't do that for legal reasons. Danforth then did some research and found out the novelization for King Kong was in public domain. Meanwhile, Universal was also wanting to remake King Kong and attempted to get the rights from RKO. In comes producer Dino De Laurentiis, who was working with Paramount, who was also going to make their own King Kong movie. De Laurentiis actually knew the owner of RKO's parent company and used his connection with that to try and secure a deal with obtaining the rights to remake King Kong from RKO, which still had their only sequels rule. However, Universal was offering an enticing $200,000 offer along with a percentage of net profit, but that money offer was matched by De Laurentiis along with offering 3% of the box office earnings. RKO was torn on which offer to choose, but Universal claimed that people at RKO made a verbal agreement to sell them the rights. And when RKO ended up making a deal with Paramount, Universal filed a lawsuit against both companies. While that was happening, Danforth would get hired to work on Universal's King Kong movie, which was given the title The Legend of King Kong. Danforth would then tell the people at Universal about the legal loophole that they can use instead to make their Kong movie, which is what Universal would do. Instead of trying to get the rights from RKO for a remake, they would instead just adapt the novelization. However, because RKO was still giving them a hard time, Danforth was forced to design original creatures because nothing from the original movie was allowed to be in their adaptation. So an outline was created and Danforth created new monsters. Eventually down the line, Paramount and Universal worked out some agreement that allowed for Paramount's Kong movie to come out first, and for Universal's to come out about a year and a half later. For the Universal movie, an outline was written and the beginning sequence is pretty much the same story you've already heard. Anne is a struggling actress. She's convinced by filmmaker Carl Denham to join him on his voyage with Jack Driscoll, and Captain Englehorn turns finds out Denim really wanted to try and find Skull Island, which they do, they reach land, run into the natives, and gets kidnapped and offered to Kong, and he takes her. Of course, there's some differences here and there about this iteration of the story, but this video is long enough without getting into specifics. But I know what you guys really want to hear about, and that's the differences between the story of Kong and Skull Island. Well, after Kong takes Anne, the rest of the group head into the uncharted jungles, running into prehistoric bugs like dragonflies and giant beetles that are feasting on the corpse of a dead Baluchitherium. The group make it to a lake and make a raft to cross it, where they encounter a duck-billed dinosaur that attacks them after Denim shoots it in an attempt to scare it away. This movie would have also featured its own log and spider pit scene had it been made, but there isn't much detail on the scene itself. Then, for the King Kong dinosaur battle, instead of a Tyrannosaurus Rex for him to fight, just like the original, Danforth decided to substitute it with 3 Triceratopses, or rather, the fictional Triclonius dinosaur designed for this movie. The fight would have ended with Kong breaking the Triclonius's jaws the same way he broke the T-Rex's jaws in the original movie. There would have been a scene shortly after of Denim running into the Triclonius corpse that's then being picked at by Archaeopteryxes. Later on, Jack would walk by the Triclonius corpse and sees that giant maggots are feeding on its dead body along with a crab picking at its eyeball. Jack eventually finds Kong's lair and gets Anne out of there while the giant ape is asleep. But they're interrupted by what was originally going to be pterosaurs, but the creature was later changed to be a teratorn, waking Kong up and chasing after the two. This leads him to what was initially going to be his battle with the Elasmosaurus, but was later changed to a centipede. In the final scene on the island, Anne and Jack make it back to the boat, but Denim is adamant on capturing Kong. This leads to Kong breaking through the wall, destroying the village, and killing many of the natives in brutal fashion, including throwing them around, throwing trees at them. There's even one part where he picks up a native, puts him in his mouth for a second, and then throws him over the wall. And in another, even more disturbing death, Kong stomps on another native, and when he sees that the man had not died, he presses his heel onto his body and grinds into him until he's dead. Eventually, Kong is knocked unconscious with chloride grenades, and the crew use the large doors from the walls meant to keep Kong out to make a raft to transport the dormant gorilla on. From here, it's back to the similar story of Kong being taken back to New York City, Denim showing him off to the public, and Kong managing to break out of his chains and escaping. There's a scene during the New York segment where Kong ventures into a construction site and runs into a steam shovel machine which is being manned by the operator who accidentally scares Kong with it and is attacked, with Kong killing the man in the process. As Kong makes his way to the Empire State Building, Denim chases after him in a stolen ambulance, hoping to capture whatever happens on film. Somehow, Denim manages to get into a plane so that he can film Kong at the top of the building, but this ends up being a fatal mistake, because Kong manages to hit his plane, causing Denim to fall to his death. Kong is shot, falls to his death, and the movie ends with a police officer stating the planes had gotten him. But a reporter at the scene, which would have been played by Fay Wray, the original Ann Darrow, as a cameo role, would disagree with the officer and say the line synonymized with this franchise, "It wasn't the airplanes, it was beauty killed the beast." As cool as the legend of King Kong sounded, by the time the year-and-a-half time frame was finally up, everyone who was once part of this production had moved on from it, and as a result, it was never made. Roger Corman's King Kong. Admittedly, there's not much on this one, but apparently, B-movie legend Roger Corman, who we've talked about heavily before regarding his Carnosaur series, was thinking about making his own King Kong remake. How invested he was into the idea, it's not 100% certain, but considering not much is known about it, the safest assumption is that it was likely just an idea that Corman was toying around with before eventually shelving it after hearing about the King Kong legal battles happening between Universal and Paramount. According to LeMay's book, Corman said at one point to the New York Magazine, "The whole thing is such a farce. It will be surprising if anything is made." I won't lie though, a Corman-produced King Kong film would be interesting to see. Although knowing Corman, he probably wouldn't make a King Kong movie, he'd probably make more like an ape movie that is meant to capitalize off of a more popular King Kong film. I don't know. Something of the like. Baby Kong. With 1976's King Kong on the horizon, it was time for lower-budget filmmakers to try and capitalize off of the hype by making their own oversized gorilla movie. Well, in this case, it actually wasn't a gorilla, it was actually a chimp. Baby Kong was an idea by Italian filmmaker Mario Bava and his colleague Luigi Borghese, who planned to have their movie come out a month before King Kong. The movie would have focused on a 12-year-old child named Eric living on an island by the Mediterranean Ocean with his mom, who works at a weather station there. Eric doesn't have many friends on the island, it seems, but he does have a chimp friend that he refers to as Baby. Baby is kidnapped by a mad scientist, Rupert Allen Crabbe, who also lives on the island and wants to use the chimp to test out what I guess is some sort of growth serum, because when injected by it, the chimp increases in size. Baby then kills Allen Crabbe after he poses a threat to Eric and himself, and is chased off into the jungle by the natives of the island who want to kill the now giant chimp. They do this by planting explosives atop a mountain to cause an avalanche to crash right on top of the chimp when detonated. The plan is successful, but Eric is almost killed in the process. In his final act, Baby rescues Eric and dies in the avalanche. In the end, though, the project was cancelled before any huge production could start, probably due to the filmmakers losing confidence in the project. 1976's King Kong original story. After De Laurentiis obtained the rights for a King Kong remake from RKO during his battle for it against Universal, he got to work with his team in developing the story. There's not too much to the original idea that was changed for the final product, only that it was to be more faithful to the original film by keeping certain elements like dinosaurs and the Empire State Building scene. However, for the dinosaur sequences, they would be heavily pruned in comparison to the original so that more time was given for Kong and the female lead to connect. This resulted in only 2 dinosaur sequences, one that would have attacked our group of characters and the other that would have likely battled against Kong. Before he was eventually hired by Universal to work on The Legend of King Kong, Danforth was asked by De Laurentiis to make a stop-motion dinosaur scene, but Danforth turned it down as he wasn't a fan of the movie's script. In the end, dinosaurs would be cut entirely and Kong battles a giant snake instead. Along with that, the movie was made to be modernized. Instead of the Empire State Building, Kong would climb the Twin Towers, and instead of airplanes, he would be shot down by helicopters. Possible sequels for 1976's King Kong. So in this section, I figured it would be better to pull all of these movie ideas together since, for the most part, they were just kind of thrown out there with no real story or development behind them. But after King Kong's decent turnout in theaters, there were several ideas for a sequel, the first of which would be given the title King Kong in Africa. Apparently, this idea came to De Laurentiis even before they finished their first King Kong movie, and as a result, he rushed to have the story outline made for it. There's not a whole lot of information out there about this one, but of what is known, this possible sequel would have included Kong being brought back to life, action sequences with helicopters and submarines, and Russian spies. How any of that would fit into the story, I have no idea. Another idea that De Laurentiis had was King Kong vs. Orca. In 1977, De Laurentiis produced a movie called Orca the Killer Whale as a way to capitalize off of Universal's Jaws at the time. I guess King Kong vs. Orca was his way to entertain the idea of a shared universe between the two monsters, but nothing happened with it. I guess eventually De Laurentiis went back to basics with his idea for a King Kong sequel, because he thought up another title called King Kong in Moscow, before coming up with yet another wild idea, this one being called Bionic Kong. Screenwriter Joanna Crawford even suggested a sort of feminist film about King Kong called Daughter of King Kong. And finally, another idea for a sequel was to make it about King Kong's son. But as far as these last 2 ideas go, De Laurentiis didn't really like them as he wanted his sequel to be focused on Kong himself. So he would revive Kong in what would eventually become known as King Kong Lives. King Kong vs. Godzilla remake. Around the mid-80s, Japan was working on a new series of Godzilla movies that started with Godzilla 1985. Despite its success, the follow-up movie, 1989's Godzilla vs. Biollante, did not do as well as Toho had hoped, so they were looking to make their next movie a guaranteed smash hit. Considering how successful King Kong vs. Godzilla was, it was only natural that Toho considered remaking the movie in the early 90s. However, back in the 60s, Toho had spent a lot of money on the rights to use King Kong, which would end up cutting back on the budget that they planned to use for the film itself, hence why it didn't look the best back in the day. Considering the amount of money they'd need to purchase the rights to King Kong, and the fact that a King Kong vs. Godzilla remake was still not a guaranteed success, Toho got cold feet and decided against the idea. As a result, no official outline was created, though one was submitted by Shinji Nishikawa, who was a part of Toho's art department, but of course, his story never went anywhere. The story would have involved a female scientist wanting to turn King Kong into a cyborg, maybe to increase his strength to fight Godzilla, or for some other possibly nefarious reason, I'm not entirely sure. But it sounds like an interesting idea. Godzilla vs. Mechanicong. When trying to get the rights for King Kong seemed bleak, Toho tried the next best thing, obtaining the rights to Mechanicong. Mechanicong's debut was in the animated King Kong show by Rankin Bass, before making its way in live-action form in King Kong Escapes. Before obtaining any legal rights to use the Mechanicong monster, an outline for the story would be written. It features Godzilla fighting a newly created monster, Gigamoth, in the United States. Godzilla is able to defeat Gigamoth, and somewhere down the line, US officials learn that there is what LeMay's book describes as a living nuclear reactor inside Godzilla. The American and Japanese governments work together to take care of the problem, with the Americans revealing their newly created Mechanicong and the Japanese revealing their technology that shrinks objects. Together, a team is shrunk and injected into Godzilla by a needle that Mechanicong is suited with. While the team attempts to take down the living nuclear reactor within Godzilla's body, Mechanicong fights him off on the outside. The outline ends with the crew managing to disable the living nuclear reactor and escaping Godzilla's body before a crack in the earth opens up, sending both Mechanicong and Godzilla falling towards their unknown fates. Yet another interesting version of King Kong, but unfortunately, Toho once again got cold feet due to the uncertainty of the copyright regarding Mechanicong. 2005's King Kong original story. In the 1980s, after a long legal battle with RKO, it was ruled out in court that the rightful owner to King Kong was Marion Cooper, but at this point he had already passed away, so the rights were handed down to his son, Richard Cooper, who would sell it to Universal in the 90s when they were looking at a second attempt to make a King Kong remake. They'd buy the rights from Cooper's son and offered it to Peter Jackson after they found out he was a big fan of the original movie. Initially, Universal tried to get Jackson to use their script for The Legend of King Kong that was made years prior, but Jackson opted to start from scratch. This started out with a script that featured a beginning sequence that introduces us to Jack Driscoll, who was a young pilot during World War I in 1917. Him and his friend are flying their Sopwith Camel biplanes before they're attacked by German bombers. When their planes are shot down, the battle continues on the ground, with Jack's friend getting killed by a German soldier, who in turn is killed by Jack. The story then focuses on Anne in present-day 1933, who is an English archaeologist in Sumatra where she and her team excavate a Hindu shrine. The dig is interrupted by the overweight but lively Carl Denham, who is a filmmaker there to make his next picture. Despite his seemingly friendly demeanor, Denham has a lack of care for anything but his films. At one point, his cameraman Herb is attacked by a tiger, which is eventually scared off by gunfire. Despite being injured from the attack, Herb continues to film, indicating the kind of work conditions he's subjected to under Denham. Later on in the script, Herb explains to Anne that according to Denham's logic, pain is temporary, film is forever. The bullets from the gunfire end up hitting a Buddha statue, revealing it to be a shell of something inside. When the outer layer is broken away, the inner statue is revealed to be of Kong himself, with a map of Skull Island engraved on a plaque under it. And for their own separate reasons, Carl and Anne both want to make the trip over there, but in this script, they really don't like each other. Through a series of events that I won't get into for the sake of brevity, they eventually make their way onto the island. When they eventually reach it, they discover ruins, more statues of Kong, and run into the island's natives, who are hostile at first, but then welcome the newcomers with some kind of fermented drink. Soon, Anglehorn and Denham, along with a few sailors, are drunk and celebrating with the natives as they prepare for their ceremony. What they don't realize is they're being prepared as sacrifices. Jack notices this and shoots one of the natives right as they're about to kill Anglehorn. Our characters are then chased back to their ship, but before they can leave, Anne is kidnapped, causing everyone to go back to save her, this time arming themselves with Thompson machine guns. From here, we get the usual story of Anne being tied to an altar, the ceremony commencing, Kong is summoned, and he takes his sacrifice. This prompts the group to head into the jungle after him, where they encounter all sorts of dinosaurs, including Lambeosaurs, Ankylosaurs, and Brontosaurs. In fact, this early script had a stampede scene in it as well. Only in this first iteration, the Brontosaurs were chased by 9-foot-tall Carnotaurs, later to be changed to the fictional raptor-like Venatosaurs. The scene plays out similarly to the final product. The group is engulfed by the stampeding Brontosaurs and have to avoid getting stepped on and avoid getting eaten by the Carnotaurs, before one of the men in the group shoots at one of the Brontosaurs, causing it to fall, leading to a domino effect of all the other Brontosaurs tripping over each other. The surviving Carnotauruses chase after the group, but in this version of the script, Herb is able to make it as he's saved by Denham, who pushes a boulder on one of the dinosaurs that tries to go after him. This leads us to the raft scene, which initially had 3 oversized axolotls, later to be changed to the Pteranodon. After the attack, the group make it onto shore, and what follows is a pretty fucked up scene. One of the axolotls emerges from the water and goes after Herb on shore, but is shot down by one of the sailors. Before the giant amphibian is killed, however, it ends up eating the camera that Herb was holding. Denham then orders Herb to retrieve the camera from the dead animal, which Herb attempts to do by opening its mouth and reaching inside. Unfortunately for Herb, the axolotl turns out to still be alive and chomps the poor cameraman up. And of course, Denham is just very insensitive about the whole thing. The next animals they encounter are a few Triceratops that one of the men end up shooting, which Kong hears in the distance. He makes his way over to the group of men, who at this point are trying to cross a log. Kong shakes them off the log and they fall down the pit, where they encounter all kinds of oversized creepy crawlies like spiders, centipedes, and crabs. Meanwhile, Anne gets attacked by an Allosaurus, which Kong fights off before 2 more Allosauruses jump into the fray. Kong kills one by shoving a tree into its mouth so hard that it pierces through the back of its head. The second one is killed after Kong breaks its back, and the third one is subjected to the iconic jaw-splitting death from the original movie. Later that night, after Anne and Kong bond, Jack attempts to rescue Anne before encountering an Elasmosaurus. When he finally reaches Anne, he grabs onto the leg of a reptilian bat thing, and with Anne holding his waist, the two are lifted off from Kong's lair before letting go to fall into the waters below. The rest of the group manage to make it back to the natives' village, which gets torn up by Kong as he continues to follow Jack and Anne through it. Denham, who initially didn't even want to capture Kong and instead wanted to leave the island as soon as he could, finally has the last-minute idea to take the giant ape back to New York to profit off of him. So Denham shoots at Kong's knee, and when he's down, Denham and the rest of the sailors beat against the ape's head until he's unconscious, much to Anne's dismay. Kong is brought to New York and is put in a theater to be shown off to everyone, which Anne attempts to stop. Denham, trying to take advantage of the situation, allows a bunch of photographers to take pictures of the moment, but this distresses the already confused Kong, causing him to break out and stomp on Denham. The scene is followed with Kong escaping the theater and following Jack and Anne, who are driving through town in a stolen cab. Jack crashes the cab while trying to escape the giant gorilla, and Anne takes the opportunity to go to Kong to get him to calm down. Kong takes her to the Empire State Building, and Jack steals a nearby biplane that was used as promotional material for a World War I movie outside a theater. He uses the plane to try to interfere with the Navy planes ordered to shoot Kong. Thinking his plane to be a threat, Kong grabs Jack's plane, but he's able to jump out last minute, land on top of the building, and meets with Anne. Kong is then shot by the Navy planes, and in his final acts of life, he picks up Anne to hold her one last time before setting her back down to Jack and falls off the building. The movie would reuse the ending from the Unmade Legend of King Kong movie, where a policeman would state that the planes had gotten Kong, only for an old woman, who was once again planned to be a cameo by Fay Wray, to disagree and respond with the classic line, "It wasn't the airplane, it was Beauty killed the Beast." The script was made back around the mid to late 90s, and the reason why Universal didn't go for it was because 2 other monster movies were being worked on and released around the same time, that being 1998's Godzilla and Mighty Joe Young. Both of these movies didn't do well in theaters, which in turn worried Universal about releasing their own monster movie of a similar nature, so they postponed the project, and when Jackson finally came back to do it several years later, changes were made to it that made it more faithful to the original. Skull Island. Skull Island was meant to be the sequel to Peter Jackson's King Kong film from 2005. At the time, Jackson was considering people like Joe Cornish and Guillermo del Toro, but it was later revealed that he also considered director Adam Wingard. In one interview, Wingard explains that around 2013, Jackson had approached him with the idea that was being worked on by Universal. While development didn't get far, apparently Jackson had a rough idea for a potential plot. He was thinking of actually making it a sort of prequel to his 2005 film by setting it in World War I. Wingard wasn't interested in that outline because at the time he was working on his own World War I film and felt that if he were to take on a King Kong movie, he'd want to set it in modern day. Wingard would work with movie producer Simon Barrett to create a rough outline for the story. Of what Wingard remembers, there would have been a rather interesting beginning sequence. According to a 2021 interview with Den of Geeks, he stated, "I remember a couple of details. It was modern day. There was some sort of opening scene where characters were in a museum and they're talking. Then at the end of the scene, it's revealed that the museum has these giant King Kong bones. He's like this relic from the past, and Skull Island is sort of a myth and nobody knows what happened to it. And somehow these characters are going back there." Wingard continues the interview saying that he also remembers an element to the story where the island would have had cloaking technology, but he doesn't fully remember. In the end, Universal ended up canceling the project. Kong Skull Island original story. When Legendary obtained the rights to King Kong, they took a very big departure with him from the other films when they made Kong Skull Island as a way to introduce him to the MonsterVerse franchise. The film had some differences in its early stages. Originally, there was going to be a beginning sequence that featured US and Japanese soldiers who somehow land on Skull Island during World War II. They'd be fighting on the beach of the island before a large gorilla emerges from the jungle. The idea was that this gorilla would purposely be given many similarities to the one from 2005 because in the next part of this scene, that very gorilla would be killed by Legendary's much bigger Kong. The scene was meant as a fun little jab to Peter Jackson's King Kong and to show the audience that this one is not like that 2005 version. This current version was much bigger and as a result, more threatening. Obviously, the idea of the sequence was scrapped. Apparently, dinosaurs were also added to the script at one point, but these were cut due to the director, Jordan Vogt Roberts, wanting his version of King Kong to be different than the previous iterations. So original fictional creatures were conceptualized, many of which went unused, including giant bugs, giant turtles, a flamenco-like bird, and a manda-like serpent with tiny legs, at least according to LeMay's book. And of course, there was also the spirit tiger, an antlered white tiger that was also cut from the movie. And finally, there was an idea for there to be a village of people that were separate from the natives of the island, and they would have been survivors of accidents that marooned them onto the island, and they would reside in a place called Boat City, which would have been made out of the remains of old, damaged, and rusted boats. Aside from that, there's not much else changed by the final film. Well, those were all of the King Kong movies that were never made. There's a lot of interesting ideas here, and it's too bad that at least some of them never came to fruition. Also, it's possible that this isn't the most definitive list. There were some examples in LeMay's book that I kind of just axed out of this list because, I don't know, I kind of just didn't think they were fit enough to be Kong movies, but then again, I'm always making exceptions for this, so maybe I should have included them. I don't know, if there's anything that I'm missing, I'll definitely make a follow-up video, but for now, I'm kind of happy where I'm leaving this list. Once again, huge shout out to John LeMay's book for helping out with this video. It was a great guideline and a massive help when it came to the research. If you want to check out the book yourself or read up on the second edition of it, I'll leave links for where you can get those down below. I hope you guys had a great 2023 and I hope you have a great 2024. Thank you all so much for the support that you've shown this channel in the past year. I'm always grateful for being able to cover these topics and I can't wait to show you guys what I have planned for 2024. If you want to support the channel in other ways, you can always check out my Patreon page. Thank you again for everything, and please, have a nice day.